Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to the History of Psychology, Part A. So again, still kind of introduction to psychology, so we're going to start off with Part A today, the kind of beginning history of psychology, and then later we'll have the second part of psychology in looking at more modern views of it. So our objectives and standards to recognize the importance of different historical periods of psychology and to summarize the contributions of individuals to psychology throughout history. And take a moment there to read the standards, please. Desired result: what is the early history of psychology? Some vocabulary here. We have structuralist. Structuralist is a psychologist who was interested in studying the basic elements that make up conscious mental experiences. Sorry about the typo there. And introspection is a method of self-observation where participants report their thoughts and feelings. Functionalists are psychologists who study the function instead of the structure of the consciousness. So the beginning of psychology. In history, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks actually, began studying the behaviors of humans in the 5th and 6th centuries BC. And they are really the first to realize that people have control over their actions and minds. And they actually also included lifespan development. And we'll talk about one of the lifespan developments be one of the first major topics we talk about here about psychology when you're a child, a teenager, an adult, and then as you become an older adult and an elderly person as well. So we'll talk about the psychology of those as well throughout life. So Renaissance and Enlightenment. In the 1500s, individuals of the Renaissance began to refine their observations through experimentation. We have, for example, Nicholas Copernicus. His picture is right down here. And also Galileo Galilei. Many big, two big thinkers of the Renaissance. Now, during the 1600s, philosophers made the idea of dualism. And dualism is the belief that the mind and body are separate and distinct. So what the mind does and the body does are different. Okay. Now, French philosopher René Descartes, his picture up here, stated that the opposite of that. He believed that the body and the mind were linked. So how we react, why we become upset causes us to cry. So again, when you become upset or, maybe even you're happy about something, extremely happy about something, you may cry, and that's your mind connected to your body. Or if you're afraid, if you're watching a scary movie, you're in a scary situation, your mind begins to feel that scary thought or scary emotion, and that causes your body to react. So your heart might race, so you might begin to get sweaty, or whatever the case may be. Descartes also believed that the mind controls the body's perceptions, sensations, and movements as well. Now, a new outlook. By the 1800s, scientists had announced that cells were the building blocks of life, and scientists began to also study natural systems in smaller pieces, looking at atoms and cells, if you can understand the scientific things or remember back to some of the science you may have learned. And from this concept, the science of psychology will form during the 1800s. So some historical approaches. Structuralism. We've already kind of talked about William Wundt a little bit, but in 1879, William Wundt established his laboratory of psychology in Leipzig, Germany, and he is credited with establishing the modern field of psychology. Again, psychology goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, but the modern field of psychology is really about the late 1800s. Now, Wundt was a structuralist, or someone who was interested in the basic elements of the human experience. Okay, so looking at the basic elements, the basic factors. And he used his method of introspection to collect data. So as we continue to look at structuralism here, in controlled situations, trained participants reported their thoughts. Wundt would then try to map out the basic structure of the thought process. Why were they thinking this? Why were they feeling this? And his approach to study humans was very important. Understanding how and why we think the way we do attracted many others to the field as well. So functionalism. Now, William James taught psychology at Harvard University in 1875 for the first time, and he is considered the father of psychology in the United States. He was also the first to write, he wrote the first textbook on psychology, The Principles of Psychology, in 1890. William James believed that feeling, thinking, learning, remembering, all activities of the mind serve one purpose, and that purpose is to help humans survive as a species. So again, the function of psychology, or the function of the brain and our mental processes or processes, is to help us survive. So James focused on the actions or functions of the conscious mind and the purpose and goals of behaviors. Now, passing on traits. Sir Francis Galton was a scientist and mathematician in the 1800s, and he wanted to understand how heredity, how our traits, our biological traits that are passed from parent to child, influence a person's character, abilities, and behavior. So what Galton did was he traced the ancestry of important people and found that greatness ran their families. He looked at famous kings and queens, looked at their parents, their grandparents, and so on and so forth, and believed that historically great traits were passed down from human beings. Now, Galton's views. He believed that greatness was a hereditary trait. And he also raised a question of getting rid of less desirable people in the world. I don't mean to laugh at that or chuckle at that, but again, this was a view of his, that less desirable people who may not show quote-unquote greatness as a hereditary trait should be gotten rid of. He suggested that good marriages to produce offspring would be preferred and would be talented. And of course now, later on, and including Galton himself realized that there are flaws in these views, right? That, greatness isn't necessarily a trait. It might be true that maybe, somebody's parents or grandparents may have been great, but that doesn't mean that they themselves will then be great in return. So again, a view, but, that turned out not to really be true. But there are advances from Galton's studies. Scientists realize that other elements can influence intelligence. So what Galton was saying overall is that traits can be passed down from our grandparents to our parents to us, is true. So it might not be greatness, like Galton had said, but there's other elements that can be passed down through our ancestors and things like that. Other elements can influence our intelligence as well, such as our environment. Were we raised in a good household, or maybe we were raised in kind of a crazy, hectic household? Our heredity, what was the intelligence of our parents? Things like that. Galton later went on to invent procedures for testing the abilities and characteristics of different people as well, and these tests were early forms of modern personality and intelligence tests, something we'll talk about much later on in the course as well. Now, Germany and Gestalt. Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Kafka. They were all German psychologists who disagreed with the ideas of structuralism and behaviorism. We'll talk a little bit more about behaviorism in our next lesson. And they argued that perception is a whole rather than the sum of its parts. Okay? It soon became known as Gestalt psychology. Now, think about this for a minute. A little confusing there. Gestalt psychology says if you look at a chair, you can understand the different parts of it, okay? But you have to understand the whole of the chair. We know it's a chair. We know that we see the legs of the chair, the backing of the chair, maybe the seat of the chair. So you can't just look at the whole thing. You need to understand the different parts of it. So that's what they're saying in terms of psychology as well, okay? Those who followed Gestalt psychology looked at how sensations assemble into perceptions. Again, things we'll talk about later on, sensation, perception, but again, understanding Gestalt psychology, that the parts help make up the whole thing as well. Alright, so our closure here. What is the early history of psychology? Think about some of the early history from the ancient Greeks through the Renaissance to the early 1800s and even up to maybe a little bit of the 1800s into the 1900s, and that will help you answer your question today. Alright, be sure to include this information in your chart. I hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and let me know of any questions or concerns. Take care. Talk to you soon.